2024. African elections. Who won and who lost in the battle for democracy? Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we provide in-depth analysis and critical discussions on African politics. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. In today's video, we're taking a closer look at Africa's democratic landscape in 2024, who came out on top and who faced major challenges. From peaceful elections to authoritarian setbacks, we'll cover the highs and lows of the continent's political journey. Stay tuned as we dive into this fascinating story. 2024 proved to be a year of significant electoral activity across the African continent, with 18 elections spanning from Senegal in West Africa to South Africa in the southern tip, and from Algeria in North Africa to Ghana in West Africa. This series of elections highlighted both the successes and the challenges facing African democracy. Despite the historic global surge in democratic engagement, more than 1.5 billion people were expected to cast their votes in elections worldwide. Africa's experience was a mixed bag of triumphs and setbacks. In this analysis, we delve into the outcomes of these elections, evaluating the victories, the setbacks, and the broader implications for African governance. Success stories: a new era of democracy in West Africa and Southern Africa. 1. Senegal, a beacon of electoral integrity. Senegal, known for its stable democratic practices in a region often plagued by political turmoil, emerged as a standout in the 2024 elections. In March, the presidential election saw Bassirou Diomaye Faye secure a decisive victory with 54% of the vote. This win was remarkable not only for Faye's political prowess, but also for the broader implications it had for democratic consolidation in Senegal. The election, though delayed by former President Macky Sall's maneuvering, was hailed for its transparent process. According to political scientist Matthias Honkpe, the election reflected both the strength of Senegal's institutions and the active role played by its citizens in safeguarding democracy. Additionally, Senegal's ruling PASTEF party dominated the parliamentary elections in November, securing a landslide victory. This success demonstrated the effectiveness of Senegal's electoral bodies and further cemented the country's role as a model for democratic practice in West Africa. 2. Ghana, a landmark election for trust and peaceful transition. Ghana, too, was lauded as a democratic success story in 2024. The December presidential election saw former President John Mahama return to power, marking a significant moment for the country. Ghana's electoral process is often cited as one of the best in Africa, with the country's electoral commission consistently working to build trust with its citizens. Honkpe praised Ghana for its political maturity, particularly noting how the opposition party peacefully conceded defeat after gathering its own results, even before the official announcement. This peaceful transfer of power stood in stark contrast to the frequent post-election violence seen in other African nations, underscoring Ghana's commitment to democracy and stability. 3. Southern Africa, peaceful transitions in Botswana and South Africa. The Southern African region also saw significant democratic milestones in 2024, particularly in Botswana and South Africa. In Botswana, President Mokgweetsi Masisi, facing a challenging electoral environment, gracefully conceded defeat after preliminary results indicated his party's loss of the parliamentary majority. This peaceful transition of power was praised as an example of democratic maturity in Africa, especially considering that Botswana's ruling party, the Botswana Democratic Party, BDP, had been in power since the country's independence in 1966. To the south, South Africa experienced a historic shift in its political landscape. The African National Congress, ANC, which has dominated the country's politics since the end of apartheid, lost its parliamentary majority for the first time. This marked a significant turning point in South African politics. The ANC agreed to form a coalition with the Democratic Alliance, indicating the country's readiness for new political dynamics. South Africa's peaceful transition of power and its role in the upcoming G20 presidency in 2025 also highlighted its continued political relevance on the global stage. Challenges to democracy, setbacks in North Africa and the Sahel. 1. North Africa, concerns over human rights and dissent. While West and Southern Africa made strides, North Africa remained more resistant to democratic reform. In both Algeria and Tunisia, the 2024 elections highlighted the challenges facing regimes that have long controlled power through undemocratic means. In Algeria, President Abdelmajid Tebboune was re-elected with a resounding 95% of the vote, but the legitimacy of his victory was questioned due to low voter turnout and concerns about the country's human rights record. Over the past decade, Algeria has faced significant economic challenges, and civil liberties, especially freedom of expression, assembly, and religion, have come under greater scrutiny. Amnesty International and other human rights organizations have repeatedly pointed to a decline in personal freedoms and increased repression. Tunisia, which was once considered a model for democratic transition following the Arab Spring, also saw a setback in 2024. President Kais Saied was re-elected with 89% of the vote, but similar to Algeria, voter turnout was dismal. The country's recent crackdowns on dissent, including limiting the rights of citizens to protest or speak freely, have raised alarms over the weakening of its democracy. Tunisia's struggle with both economic instability and political repression further eroded public confidence in its democratic institutions. 2. Mozambique, a deepening crisis in democracy. Mozambique's 2024 elections, which took place in October, ended in a deadlock that exacerbated political tensions in the country. The Frelimo Party, which has held power for more than 5 decades, was confirmed as the winner by the country's highest court. However, the elections were marred by allegations of fraud and electoral manipulation. Opposition leader Venancio Mondlane, who had been exiled, claimed the results were rigged. The violent protests and clashes that erupted in the wake of the election highlighted the growing discontent with Frelimo's monopoly on power and its failure to deliver genuine democratic reforms. With 125 people killed in just 3 days following the election results, Mozambique faces a crisis that threatens its already fragile democratic institutions. 3. The Sahel, military coups and regime change. The Sahel region, which includes Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, has experienced a dramatic regression in democracy since a series of military coups ousted civilian governments. In Mali, the military junta's repeated postponement of elections initially scheduled for February 2024 raises serious concerns about the future of democracy in the country. Similarly, the junta in Niger, which took power in a coup in 2023, has refused to honor promises of a return to civilian rule. According to Alexandra Didier Amani, from the NGO Tournons La Page, the region is witnessing the closure of civic spaces, the silencing of opposition voices, and an alarming rise in political violence. A forward-looking approach. What's next for African democracy? As we reflect on the 2024 elections across Africa, several key themes emerge that can shape the future of the continent's democratic trajectory. Firstly, institutional integrity remains a cornerstone of successful democracy. Senegal and Ghana have demonstrated the importance of transparent electoral bodies and the commitment to peaceful transitions of power. Other countries could learn from their practices by investing in independent electoral commissions and ensuring that elections are free from manipulation. Secondly, human rights must be a central focus for Africa's democratic future. As seen in Algeria, Tunisia, and Mozambique, the erosion of civil liberties leads to weakened trust in democratic institutions. African leaders should prioritize human rights as a foundational element of governance. Lastly, regional cooperation and solidarity will be crucial. The political instability in the Sahel shows that regional blocs like ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, must be more proactive in supporting democratic processes and holding military juntas accountable. As Africa continues to grapple with its political evolution, the lessons learned from 2024 elections will help shape the continent's democratic future. While many countries have made significant strides, the challenges of governance, human rights, and political stability remain pressing. The coming years will be decisive in determining whether Africa can move beyond its historical struggles to create a truly democratic and prosperous future. While 2024 showed both progress and setbacks in Africa's democratic landscape, the continent's path forward is filled with both challenges and opportunities. From institutional reforms to the need for strengthened political culture, Several critical aspects must be addressed to ensure that Africa can build on its successes and mitigate its failures. Institutional reforms, building trust in electoral systems. A critical takeaway from the 2024 elections is the importance of electoral integrity. As seen in Senegal, Ghana, and Botswana, transparent, fair elections where opposition parties respect the results foster greater trust in democratic systems. However, these positive examples must be replicated across the continent, especially in nations like Mozambique, Algeria, and Tunisia, where accusations of rigged elections and undemocratic practices continue to undermine the electoral process. To address these challenges, African governments must prioritize electoral reforms that ensure the independence of election commissions and improve public confidence in the election process. A key step in this direction is adopting technology to improve transparency. Electronic voting systems, transparent reporting mechanisms, and real-time election monitoring could go a long way in reducing electoral fraud and enhancing legitimacy. In many African countries, the credibility of election outcomes is undercut by political manipulation. Institutional reforms must address these issues, particularly focusing on separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary. Strengthening the role of the Electoral Commission and ensuring its autonomy from political influence is paramount. The role of civil society, as seen in Ghana and Senegal, is also crucial in ensuring that elections remain credible. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and international observers must continue to play a central role in election monitoring, advocating for greater transparency and fairness. Human rights, a pillar of sustainable democracy. One of the most significant challenges facing African democracies in 2024 has been the erosion of human rights and civil liberties. As seen in Tunisia, Algeria, and other authoritarian-leaning nations, the suppression of free speech, the crackdown on opposition, and restrictions on the right to protest are increasingly common. This raises a critical question. Can African democracies thrive without respecting fundamental human rights? The short answer is no. For democracy to take root and flourish, it must be underpinned by a culture of human rights. The examples of repression in countries like Tunisia and Algeria are alarming. The militarization of politics in regions like the Sahel and the growing authoritarianism in countries like Ethiopia, where political space has narrowed, underscore the need for stronger protections for basic freedoms. The international community, as well as African Union, AU, member states, must work together to pressure authoritarian regimes to honor human rights commitments. Regional institutions such as the AU and ECOWAS must hold members accountable and offer political and diplomatic support to countries struggling with human rights violations. Moreover, civil society organizations must continue advocating for more robust protections for marginalized groups, including women, ethnic minorities, and LGBTQ+ individuals, who remain at risk of violence and discrimination in many parts of the continent. Political culture, strengthening civic engagement. Beyond institutional reforms and human rights protections, political culture will play a significant role in shaping Africa's democratic future. In countries like Senegal and Ghana, elections are characterized by peaceful transitions, which suggest a mature political culture. However, in nations like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, the rise of military regimes and the erosion of democratic norms show how fragile Africa's political culture remains. Civic engagement is crucial to sustaining democracy. Encouraging voter participation, building trust in political institutions, and promoting peaceful political discourse are essential to countering the rise of authoritarianism. In countries like Tunisia and Algeria, where there are restrictions on political opposition, the participation of a broad spectrum of society in political decision-making is essential to counteracting the influence of a few elites. Youth involvement in politics is especially important. Africa's youth bulge presents both a challenge and an opportunity for the continent. Young people must be educated about democratic values, and their voices must be heard in policy debates. Additionally, political parties must play a role in fostering a healthy political culture. Ghana's example, where political parties show respect for election results, offers a model for the continent. A culture of political tolerance, where the opposition has the right to criticize the ruling party without fear of violence or repression, must be cultivated across Africa. The Sahel and beyond, tackling regional instability. One of the most pressing concerns for African democracy is the Sahel region, where military coups and insurgencies are eroding democratic norms. As the year 2024 demonstrated, countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso face increasing political instability as military juntas continue to consolidate power. The coup in Niger in 2023 and the subsequent events underscore a widespread crisis of governance in the region. The Sahel's struggle with instability is not just a political issue, but also a security and humanitarian crisis. The rise of militant groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and the devastating effects of climate change, exacerbate the region's political fragility. These factors make it incredibly difficult to establish democratic institutions, as the states struggle to maintain control over their territories. In response to this crisis, regional cooperation will be essential. The Sahel states must work together through regional organizations like ECOWAS to address the political and security challenges that threaten the stability of their democracies. However, this cooperation must be accompanied by efforts to rebuild state institutions, strengthen the rule of law, and engage in inclusive dialogue with various political and ethnic groups. Opportunities for future growth, economic and social development. While 2024 saw setbacks in governance, the continent's economic potential remains a powerful driver for political change. As more countries embrace economic reforms and focus on poverty alleviation, the prospects for democratic consolidation improve. Economic stability is essential for political stability, and African governments should prioritize initiatives that boost job creation, access to education, and infrastructure development. Furthermore, regional integration through organizations like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, presents an opportunity for African nations to work together toward common goals, including stronger economies and improved governance. By fostering economic partnerships, Africa can reduce its reliance on foreign aid and assert its political and economic independence. The role of international actors, support, and accountability. One significant factor in the future of African democracy is the role of international actors. While regional efforts are essential, the involvement of the international community, including the United Nations, the European Union, and other global players, can be a force for good or, at times, a source of challenges. The international community has a responsibility to both support democratic processes and hold African governments accountable when they fall short. For example, the United Nations and regional bodies such as the African Union, AU, and ECOWAS can play a pivotal role in monitoring elections and facilitating peaceful transitions of power. In countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, international actors can work with local governments to ensure that democratic governance is restored. Moreover, they can offer technical assistance and support in areas like electoral reform, voter registration, and capacity building for electoral commissions. However, international support must not be seen as interference. Rather, it should focus on partnerships that respect the sovereignty of African nations while ensuring democratic principles are upheld. At the same time, international actors must maintain the political will to impose sanctions or diplomatic pressure when governments fall into autocratic practices or when elections are clearly compromised. The EU's role in monitoring elections in places like Ghana and Senegal serves as an example of positive engagement. However, in Algeria, Tunisia, and other nations where democracy is increasingly under threat, international organizations must be more vocal and proactive in denouncing undemocratic practices and supporting local civil society organizations in their efforts to push for democratic reforms. Africa's youth and the future of democracy. One of the most exciting developments in 2024 has been the growing engagement of Africa's youth in the political process. With 60% of Africa's population under the age of 25, young people represent both the hope and the challenge for African democracies. The enthusiasm of youth for democratic reforms, social justice, and anti-corruption movements signals a shift in political dynamics across the continent. The pro-democracy protests in countries like Tunisia, Sudan, and Zimbabwe have shown that young Africans are increasingly willing to demand change from their governments. Youth-driven movements such as EndSARS in Nigeria and This Flag in Zimbabwe have galvanized entire generations, making it clear that Africa's youth are no longer passive bystanders in their country's political futures. In many cases, they have used social media to organize, challenge political elites, and raise awareness about issues like corruption, government accountability, and human rights abuses. These movements demonstrate that the future of African democracy is likely to be shaped by younger generations who are tech-savvy, vocal, and ready to confront injustice. A need for political accountability and anti-corruption reforms. Another key element in the evolution of African democracy is the need for political accountability and anti-corruption reforms. Corruption remains one of the greatest barriers to democratic governance across the continent. The World Bank and Transparency International regularly rank African nations among the most corrupt in the world. This systemic corruption undermines public trust in democratic institutions and hampers development efforts. In 2024, anti-corruption measures in countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa demonstrated that progress is possible. Kenya's Directorate of Criminal Investigations, DCI, has been active in investigating high-level corruption, while South Africa's state capture inquiry has exposed the pervasive influence of corruption in the country's political and business sectors. These investigations offer a glimpse into the future where accountability is prioritized, but the challenge remains. Will political will persist to tackle these issues head-on? Countries such as Botswana and Ghana have shown that it is possible to build accountable, transparent governments. For example, in Ghana, efforts to clean up public procurement and improve the judicial system have been met with success. However, institutional weaknesses, particularly in the judicial and police systems, remain obstacles to progress in many African countries. To strengthen African democracies, there is an urgent need to address judicial independence, anti-corruption laws, and political financing. International pressure and civil society activism will remain key in pushing governments to act. The African Union has established frameworks like the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, which aims to promote good governance, human rights, and democracy. However, greater emphasis should be placed on enforcing these frameworks and ensuring they lead to tangible reforms. The role of technology in strengthening democracy. Another crucial factor in the future of African democracy is the potential role of technology in improving governance. From digital voting systems to the use of social media for political engagement, technology is reshaping the landscape of African politics. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the adoption of digital solutions, and this trend will continue in 2024 and beyond. Digital platforms can help increase transparency, engage voters, and provide governments with data that can improve policymaking. For instance, Kenya and Nigeria have utilized digital platforms to facilitate voter registration and election monitoring. In the long term, embracing digital democracy could empower citizens to hold their governments accountable, combat corruption, and push for transparency. However, there are challenges as well. Digital security is a concern, especially in countries with weak infrastructure or repressive regimes that use technology to monitor and silence opposition voices. The rise of fake news and disinformation poses another challenge, particularly in highly polarized political environments. Governments and tech companies will need to collaborate to ensure that technology is used to promote democracy rather than undermine it. The role of regional integration in strengthening democracy. Finally, regional integration will play a pivotal role in Africa's democratic future. The African Union, AU, ECOWAS, and other regional organizations have made significant strides in promoting peace, security, and democracy across the continent. However, there is still much work to be done in ensuring that these organizations are effective in enforcing democratic norms. For example, in West Africa, ECOWAS has played a leading role in addressing military coups and promoting democratic governance. However, ECOWAS's ability to enforce sanctions or intervene in member states remains limited, especially when political will is lacking. The creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, is another exciting development that could strengthen democracy in Africa. By fostering economic cooperation and increasing trade between African nations, AFCFTA can help reduce regional inequalities and build stronger economic foundations for democracy. Looking ahead, a call for resilience. As we move beyond 2024, Africa's journey toward democratic consolidation will undoubtedly be challenging, but it is not insurmountable. The continent has made great strides in some regions, particularly in West Africa and Southern Africa, but several challenges remain, including the erosion of civil liberties, institutional corruption, and political instability in the Sahel. To ensure a prosperous democratic future, African nations must prioritize electoral integrity, human rights, political accountability, and regional cooperation. Youth participation in politics, coupled with effective use of technology and stronger regional integration, will also be crucial in shaping the future of African governance. The role of civil society in strengthening democracy. In addition to political and institutional reforms, the role of civil society remains indispensable to the continued advancement of democracy across Africa. Civil society organizations, CSOs, including non-governmental organizations, NGOs, advocacy groups, and grassroots movements, have historically been at the forefront of promoting democratic values, human rights, and transparency. In countries like Senegal, Ghana, and South Africa, civil society has played a pivotal role in strengthening democratic governance. These organizations have pushed for accountability, transparency, and greater citizen participation in political processes. They have advocated for free and fair elections, anti-corruption measures, and the protection of civil liberties. In Senegal, for example, the activism of civil society groups helped ensure that electoral processes were safeguarded from political manipulation and that results were respected by all parties involved. However, in many African countries, civil society organizations are facing increasing repression, particularly in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes. In places like Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda, space for dissent has been shrinking, with governments cracking down on opposition parties, activists, and independent media. This repression undermines democracy by silencing critical voices and stifling political debate. For African democracies to thrive, it is essential that civil society remains robust and empowered. Legal protections for NGOs, journalists, and activists are needed to allow these groups to carry out their work without fear of retribution. Governments must recognize that a vibrant civil society is not a threat, but a necessary component of a functioning democracy. Efforts should be made to expand civic spaces, allowing citizens to engage freely in political discussions, organize protests, and participate in decision-making processes. Challenges to media freedom, the fight for independent journalism. In 2024, the state of media freedom across Africa remained a significant concern. While some countries have vibrant independent media landscapes, others continue to face challenges related to press censorship, intimidation, and journalist arrests. The International Press Institute, IPI, and Reporters Without Borders consistently rank several African countries poorly in terms of press freedom. In countries such as Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, independent journalism is heavily restricted, and journalists often face harassment or imprisonment for simply reporting on government actions. The situation is particularly dire in countries with fragile democracies, where media outlets are often owned or controlled by political elites. State-sponsored media often broadcast pro-government narratives, drowning out critical voices and offering a limited view of political developments. In Algeria and Tunisia, where media independence is under siege, the government's attempts to silence dissent have increasingly curtailed press freedoms, making it harder for citizens to access unbiased information. For democracy to flourish, an independent press is critical. Journalists must be able to report freely without fear of retaliation, and media outlets should be allowed to function without undue interference from political authorities. Efforts to ensure media diversity and the protection of journalists are essential to preserving democratic norms. Governments must prioritize reforms that ensure that the press can hold those in power accountable and provide citizens with the information necessary to make informed decisions. Economic growth and its role in strengthening democratic institutions. A key challenge facing African democracies is the relationship between economic growth and political stability. Many African countries continue to grapple with economic inequality, poverty, and unemployment, which often fuel political discontent and social unrest. Economic hardship can also undermine the legitimacy of elected governments and push citizens toward populist leaders who promise quick fixes. In South Africa, Botswana, and Ghana, economic growth has been relatively stable, allowing for the development of democratic institutions. However, in many other African countries, economic stagnation and mismanagement have stifled democratic progress. Corruption, lack of investment in infrastructure, and ineffective governance have led to high levels of inequality and public frustration. To secure a sustainable future for democracy, African governments must focus on inclusive economic growth. This includes creating jobs, improving education and healthcare systems, and investing in small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. Economic opportunities, particularly for youth and women, can help strengthen social cohesion and reduce political instability. Africa's young population presents both a challenge and an opportunity. As the continent's labor force grows, governments must ensure that this demographic is empowered with the skills, opportunities, and platforms to participate in economic and political processes. Failure to do so may lead to greater political alienation and social unrest, weakening the democratic fabric. Additionally, economic growth can help reinforce democratic institutions by providing governments with the resources needed to improve services, strengthen the rule of law, and ensure that democratic processes are protected. However, economic prosperity must be equally distributed to ensure that the benefits of growth reach all sectors of society, particularly the marginalized and vulnerable. Regional cooperation and the importance of Pan-Africanism. As Africa faces a wide range of political, social, and economic challenges, the need for regional cooperation becomes even more urgent. Pan-Africanism, the idea of African countries working together for mutual benefit, is essential to addressing shared challenges. African countries must recognize the value of regional integration, particularly through organizations like the African Union, AU, ECOWAS, and the East African Community, EAC. These regional organizations have the potential to become effective vehicles for promoting peace and democracy on the continent. For example, the AU's Peace and Security Council has played a role in responding to political crises in countries like South Sudan and Somalia, providing diplomatic interventions and supporting peacekeeping missions. ECOWAS, too, has been active in West Africa, working to resolve conflicts and support the restoration of democratic governments. Regional integration, particularly through the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, can also foster economic cooperation and help address issues like poverty and inequality. By creating a single market for goods and services, Africa can reduce its dependence on external powers and enhance its ability to negotiate on the global stage. Regional trade and economic partnerships can create jobs, enhance economic stability, and lay the groundwork for stronger democratic institutions. However, to realize these opportunities, African nations must overcome challenges such as political fragmentation, border disputes, and cultural differences. Political will is essential for achieving regional integration that benefits all African countries, regardless of their size, wealth, or political orientation. A renewed vision for the future. Moving beyond the challenges. Looking toward the future, Africa's democratic journey hinges on transformational leadership, institutional integrity, and citizen engagement. While the road ahead is fraught with challenges, the continent's ability to learn from past experiences, adapt to changing circumstances, and collaborate regionally offers hope for a better democratic future. The key to progress will be building inclusive institutions that promote peace, security, and accountability, ensuring that every African citizen has a stake in the future of their country. Leaders who embrace democratic reforms, human rights, and economic development will have the opportunity to leave a lasting legacy for future generations. Africa's democracy is still in the making, and the choices made today will determine the trajectory for the generations to come. As the continent moves forward, it must remain steadfast in its commitment to good governance, human dignity, and inclusive development. Only then can Africa realize its full democratic potential, a potential that holds promise for not just the continent, but for the world. The need for democratic resilience in the face of external pressures. As African countries continue to navigate the complexities of democratic development, they must also contend with external pressures that can either bolster or hinder their efforts. Global powers, international organizations, and foreign investors can significantly influence the democratic trajectory of African nations. While positive partnerships with external actors can foster economic growth and political stability, external interference and neo-colonial tendencies can undermine sovereignty and exacerbate governance challenges. For instance, the influence of foreign aid and economic partnerships often comes with strings attached, such as political or economic demands that may not always align with the country's best interests. In some cases, this has led to situations where African governments prioritize the interests of foreign donors over those of their own citizens, compromising democratic accountability. This is particularly evident in countries where external debt has spiraled, leading to greater dependence on international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. However, Africa has shown resilience in its efforts to assert its sovereignty on the global stage. Through initiatives like AFCFTA, African nations are working to build more self-reliant economies that are less susceptible to external manipulation. By fostering regional trade agreements and economic partnerships within the continent, African countries can reduce their reliance on foreign powers and assert greater control over their economic and political future. Furthermore, Africa's engagement with multilateral organizations such as the United Nations, UN, World Trade Organization, WTO, and G20 provides an opportunity to amplify its voice on the world stage. As seen with South Africa's recent presidency of the G20, African nations are beginning to play a more prominent role in shaping global governance, particularly around issues like climate change, sustainable development, and human rights. The critical role of education in strengthening democracy. One of the most effective ways to promote lasting democratic change in Africa is by investing in education. An educated populace is essential for the success of any democratic system, as citizens must be informed, engaged, and capable of making educated decisions at the polls. In many parts of Africa, access to quality education remains a significant challenge. While some countries, particularly in East and Southern Africa, have made strides in improving education infrastructure, much of the continent continues to face inequitable access to education, especially for girls and rural populations. The lack of sufficient investment in education leads to low literacy rates, inadequate civic education, and a lack of understanding of democratic processes. For democracy to thrive in Africa, it is crucial to prioritize inclusive education that focuses not only on academic skills, but also on the values that underpin democratic governance. Civic education, for example, can help citizens understand their rights and responsibilities, the importance of voting, and the role of political institutions in their lives. Moreover, critical thinking skills should be fostered so that the electorate can engage with political issues in a nuanced and informed way. Governments must also invest in higher education to build a generation of well-educated leaders who can effectively steer their countries toward democratic development. African universities and research institutions have an important role to play in providing the intellectual foundation for democratic governance. Educational reforms, including the improvement of curricula, the training of teachers, and the expansion of access to quality education, will be essential in fostering a democratic culture. Youth leadership, catalyzing change from within. With a large proportion of Africa's population under the age of 25, the potential of the youth to drive democratic change is unparalleled. In 2024, young people across Africa have increasingly become agents of change, leveraging social media and digital platforms to voice their concerns, mobilize support, and hold governments accountable. From the NSARS movement in Nigeria to the This Flag protests in Zimbabwe, young Africans are demonstrating that they are not content to sit on the sidelines. These movements show a growing awareness of the importance of good governance, accountability, and human rights among the youth. However, as Africa's youth become more politically engaged, they face numerous challenges, including political repression, unemployment, and lack of political representation. To ensure that the youth can play a meaningful role in African democracies, it is crucial that youth empowerment becomes a priority for African governments. This includes providing young people with the tools and platforms to engage in political discourse, run for office, and participate fully in civic life. Governments should create an enabling environment where young people are not only encouraged to engage in politics, but are also given the resources and opportunities to do so. Political parties should make a concerted effort to engage with the youth, ensuring that their voices are heard and their needs addressed. The youth should not only be seen as supporters of political movements, but as leaders capable of shaping the future of their countries. Youth leadership programs, mentorship, and political training can help cultivate the next generation of African leaders who are committed to democratic principles and values. Addressing conflict and violence, a key challenge for democratic progress. While many African nations have made strides toward democratic governance, conflict and violence remain major obstacles to political stability and democratic consolidation. From civil wars to militant insurgencies, conflict continues to plague parts of the continent, undermining efforts to build lasting democratic institutions. The Sahel region, encompassing countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, has been particularly affected by armed insurgencies, and military coups have exacerbated the instability. These challenges not only threaten national security, but also disrupt the democratic process, as military juntas undermine democratic norms and hinder civilian governance. In addition to violent conflicts, ethnic tensions, religious conflicts, and climate-induced migration exacerbate political instability in many African countries. Countries like Ethiopia and Sudan have experienced significant internal strife, and the ripple effects of these conflicts have spilled over into neighboring nations, creating wider regional instability. To address these challenges, African countries must prioritize conflict resolution and peace-building efforts. Regional organizations such as the African Union and ECOWAS must be more proactive in mediating disputes, offering diplomatic solutions, and supporting peace processes. Additionally, African leaders should invest in conflict prevention strategies that address the root causes of violence, such as poverty, inequality, and poor governance. Transitional justice mechanisms will also be crucial in post-conflict settings to ensure that the rule of law is restored, perpetrators of violence are held accountable, and reconciliation is achieved. Only by addressing the underlying causes of conflict and violence can Africa hope to build lasting democratic institutions that are free from the threat of destabilization. The path forward, ensuring sustainable democratic development. The journey towards sustainable democracy in Africa is a long and complex one. While significant progress has been made in some regions, challenges such as institutional weakness, economic inequality, and political repression remain prevalent. For African democracy to thrive in the coming decades, it will require a collective effort from governments, civil society, international actors, and citizens themselves. Key to this effort will be ensuring that democratic values are embedded in all facets of African society, from education to governance, from the economy to political discourse. By focusing on human rights, accountability, and inclusive economic development, African nations can begin to create the conditions for long-term democratic stability. While the future is fraught with challenges, the opportunities for progress are significant. The next generation of African leaders, equipped with the lessons of the past and the tools of the future, can drive the continent toward a more democratic, prosperous, and stable future. The power of African diaspora, strengthening democracy from abroad. The African diaspora plays an increasingly vital role in shaping the future of the continent's democracies. With millions of Africans living outside the continent, particularly in regions like Europe, North America, and the Middle East, the diaspora community has the potential to contribute significantly to political and economic development. In 2024, many African nations began to recognize the importance of engaging their diaspora not just for remittances, but for political and democratic engagement. The diaspora's role is multifaceted. First, they are vital sources of financial support, sending billions of dollars in remittances that help sustain families and contribute to economic growth. This financial power can be leveraged to promote democratic ideals by funding civil society organizations, human rights initiatives, and democracy-building programs. Through these contributions, the diaspora is already indirectly supporting democratic movements and fostering political activism across Africa. Additionally, the African diaspora plays an active role in advocacy. Many members of the diaspora are deeply invested in the political health of their home countries. In 2024, diaspora-led movements, such as those advocating for free and fair elections and accountability in governance, gained momentum. The diaspora's ability to mobilize international support and put pressure on African governments is crucial in holding leaders accountable for their actions, especially in cases where domestic opposition is repressed or silenced. Moreover, the diaspora is increasingly becoming a source of intellectual and political capital. Many African expatriates have pursued higher education and have experience in governance, public policy, and international relations. Their expertise can be a powerful resource for African governments looking to implement democratic reforms and good governance practices. The collaboration between homegrown leaders and diaspora professionals can provide the technocratic solutions necessary to address governance challenges, improve policy development, and enhance institutional capacity. For African democracies to grow and evolve, it is essential that governments actively engage with their diaspora. This could be done through policy initiatives aimed at promoting diaspora investment in local governance or establishing platforms where diaspora voices are represented in political decision-making. Such efforts would allow the diaspora to have a more direct role in shaping Africa's democratic future. Global trends and their impact on African democracy. The global political landscape in 2024 is in a state of flux, with rising authoritarianism, populism, and nationalism in many parts of the world. These trends have had mixed effects on African democracies, both positive and negative. On one hand, the international community's support for democracy remains strong, particularly among Western nations and international organizations like the United Nations, but the rise of autocratic leadership in places like Russia and China provides an alternative model of governance that some African leaders might find appealing. For African nations striving to strengthen their democratic institutions, these global shifts present both challenges and opportunities. The growing populist movements in Europe and the United States, along with the political realignment of major powers, could lead to a diminished commitment to supporting democratic causes abroad. This potential shift in international priorities may result in reduced pressure on African governments to uphold democratic norms, particularly those in power who may be tempted by authoritarian models. Conversely, global democratization efforts continue to be championed by civil society groups and international democracy watchdogs. The European Union and United States have historically supported pro-democracy initiatives in Africa through programs that promote free elections, human rights, and good governance. As these actors adapt to the changing global political environment, they must also maintain their focus on supporting Africa's democratic aspirations, particularly as new global powers assert their influence. The rise of China's Belt and Road Initiative and increasing Chinese influence in Africa's infrastructure and energy sectors offers a stark contrast to the Western model of aid-based diplomacy. China's non-interventionist foreign policy and lack of conditionalities have been particularly attractive to African leaders seeking economic development without the political pressure for democratic reforms. While this model has contributed to economic growth, it has also created concerns regarding the sustainability of democratic values under Chinese influence. A unified voice for Africa, strengthening Pan-African institutions. In the face of both internal and external challenges, Pan-African institutions like the African Union, AU, and ECOWAS have a critical role to play in the future of Africa's democracies. While they have made notable strides in fostering cooperation and conflict resolution, these institutions must evolve to better address the growing threats to democracy on the continent. In 2024, the AU and ECOWAS have taken steps to reinforce their commitment to democracy. In particular, ECOWAS has been proactive in responding to military coups and constitutional violations in the Sahel region and elsewhere, as seen in the recent political transitions in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. While these actions demonstrate regional solidarity, the effectiveness of these organizations in enforcing democracy remains limited by political and economic realities. Greater political will is needed within these organizations to address authoritarianism, military takeovers, and undemocratic practices across the continent. One of the AU's central challenges is how to maintain unity and ensure that member states comply with democratic norms. The African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, a voluntary initiative by the AU, offers a potential framework for monitoring and promoting democratic practices, yet it has struggled with enforcement. A stronger commitment to democratic accountability within the AU is essential, particularly as the political landscape across Africa becomes increasingly volatile. The Continental Free Trade Agreement, AfCFTA, as well as initiatives aimed at regional economic integration, should not only focus on economic growth, but also be linked with democratic reforms and human rights protection. By incorporating governance standards and human rights principles into economic agreements, African countries can build a more holistic approach to development, one that balances economic progress with the strengthening of democratic institutions. The impact of climate change on African democracy. Climate change remains one of the most pressing global challenges, and its impact on African democracies cannot be overstated. In 2024, climate-induced crises such as droughts, flooding, and food insecurity are increasingly destabilizing many African countries, contributing to migration, conflict, and economic instability. These environmental stresses often exacerbate existing social and political challenges, creating fertile ground for authoritarian leaders to seize power by promising quick solutions to complex problems. For example, in countries like Somalia and Ethiopia, drought and climate-induced migration have fueled tensions between ethnic groups and heightened the risk of political instability. In some instances, authoritarian governments use the climate crisis as an opportunity to consolidate power, circumvent democratic processes, and curtail freedom of speech and press. However, there is also an opportunity for African democracies to integrate climate change adaptation into the broader governance framework. Environmental policies that promote sustainable development, resilience, and community-driven solutions can strengthen democratic systems by addressing the underlying causes of conflict and political instability. African leadership in climate governance will not only ensure the survival of the environment, but will also provide a foundation for strengthening democratic institutions and reducing political tensions. African countries must take a proactive stance in addressing climate change through regional cooperation, international partnerships, and domestic policies. Integrating climate resilience into national development plans and democratic governance will be essential in ensuring that Africa's political future remains stable and sustainable in the face of increasingly unpredictable environmental challenges. The path forward: fostering an inclusive and democratic Africa. The year 2024 has highlighted the stark contrasts in Africa's democratic trajectory. On the one hand, free and fair elections, political transitions, and civic engagement in countries like Senegal, Ghana, and Botswana provide hope for a future where democracy can thrive. On the other hand, authoritarian tendencies, military coups, and regression in human rights continue to pose significant obstacles to the consolidation of democracy across the continent. For Africa to move forward, it must focus on inclusive governance, regional cooperation, youth empowerment, and economic development. The lessons of 2024 must be built upon, ensuring that democratic resilience becomes a central theme in Africa's development agenda. The involvement of the diaspora, civil society, and youth will be crucial in shaping a more democratic and prosperous future. The role of international solidarity, building stronger alliances for democracy. While Africa continues its journey toward democratic consolidation, it is essential that the continent does not do so in isolation. International solidarity will play a crucial role in reinforcing democratic efforts across the continent. Global partnerships, both within and outside the African continent, can provide the necessary support structures for democratic growth, stability, and governance. The role of foreign aid and international investment should be focused on democracy-building programs, but this assistance must be strategic and designed to support long-term reforms rather than temporary political fixes. Donors and international organizations must align their investments with African-led priorities, ensuring that African governments and civil society groups take the lead in designing and implementing reforms. External actors should avoid imposing one-size-fits-all solutions, but should rather tailor their support to local contexts and the specific needs of each country. For instance, countries in East Africa, like Kenya and Tanzania, have seen significant improvements in governance, largely due to international support that has been focused on strengthening democratic institutions, civil society engagement, and election integrity. These partnerships have helped improve electoral processes, enhance voter education, and promote gender equality in politics. African nations must continue to foster such partnerships, emphasizing that ownership of the reform process lies within Africa, even as international partners support the journey. Moreover, regional cooperation in Africa must be bolstered through stronger Pan-African frameworks. The African Union, AU, should continue to lead the charge in fostering cooperation across the continent, but its efforts must be met with increased political will from African governments. When African countries work together toward common democratic goals, they can create a more unified approach to addressing the region's challenges. The African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, can be a useful tool in helping countries hold each other accountable to democratic standards, ensuring that regional cooperation translates into meaningful change. In this sense, global diplomacy plays a crucial role. Multilateral bodies such as the United Nations and G20, as well as regional organizations, should continue to provide diplomatic support to African countries that are striving for democratic progress. Their involvement can bring critical international attention to instances where democracy is under threat, whether from military coups or authoritarian practices. The digital revolution in African democracy, a double-edged sword. The impact of digital technology on African democracy cannot be overstated. While the continent has seen remarkable improvements in mobile phone penetration and internet access, particularly in East Africa, digital technologies represent a double-edged sword in terms of their influence on governance and democracy. On the positive side, the widespread use of social media has revolutionized political discourse. Platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp have allowed citizens to organize political movements, hold governments accountable, and share information that may have otherwise been censored. For example, NSARS in Nigeria and Tupward This Flag in Zimbabwe are just two examples of how digital platforms have provided a space for youth-led activism that challenges the status quo. In countries with repressive regimes, these platforms have given opposition leaders and civil society organizations the ability to communicate freely, bypassing traditional media channels that may be controlled by the government. Furthermore, digital technology has become a vital tool in election monitoring, with international observers and civil society groups using mobile apps and data analytics to track voting patterns, report electoral fraud, and ensure that elections are free and fair. In countries like Kenya and Liberia, these technological tools have empowered both citizens and independent observers to increase transparency in the electoral process. However, the digital revolution also poses significant challenges. In many African countries, internet censorship is increasingly being used as a tool of political repression. Governments have deployed internet shutdowns or social media blackouts during periods of political unrest or in the lead-up to elections. These digital crackdowns are meant to prevent opposition movements from organizing and sharing information, but they also violate citizens' right to freedom of expression. Additionally, the rise of disinformation and fake news is a growing concern in the digital space. As social media becomes the primary source of information for millions of Africans, false narratives and rumors can quickly spread, leading to political polarization, social unrest, and even violence. In countries like South Africa and Nigeria, the rapid spread of misleading information has fueled ethnic and political tensions, complicating efforts to promote peaceful democratic transitions. To harness the positive potential of digital technology, African governments must implement robust digital governance policies that prioritize freedom of information, privacy protection, and countering disinformation. Independent regulatory bodies should be empowered to ensure that the internet remains a free space for citizens to engage in democratic dialogue while holding malicious actors accountable for spreading falsehoods. Additionally, media literacy programs must be established to help citizens critically evaluate the information they receive online and avoid falling victim to misleading narratives. The intersection of gender equality and democracy. A critical factor in the success of African democracies is the integration of gender equality into political, economic, and social spheres. Despite progress, women across Africa continue to face political marginalization, economic inequality, and discrimination, all of which undermine the democratic values of inclusivity and representative governance. In recent years, there have been notable strides in gender equality in African politics. Countries like Rwanda and Senegal have seen increased female representation in government, with Rwanda leading the world in women's parliamentary representation. These countries have shown that increasing women's participation in political processes is not only a matter of fairness, but also an issue of good governance. Women bring unique perspectives to the decision-making process, particularly around issues of health, education, and social welfare, which are essential for the development of well-rounded democratic policies. However, the gender gap in African politics remains wide. In many countries, patriarchal systems continue to limit women's access to political office and influence. Social norms, discriminatory laws, and violence against women also act as barriers to gender equality. Furthermore, women's involvement in the informal economy and care economy often goes unrecognized, meaning their contributions to society and the economy are often excluded from political discussions and policy making. To ensure that African democracies are truly inclusive, it is imperative that gender equality be a central tenet of democratic reform. African governments must enforce policies that promote equal representation in politics, ensure that women's voices are heard in governance, and protect women's rights both within the political sphere and beyond. Additionally, governments must provide economic opportunities for women, particularly in sectors where they have been historically excluded. Promoting gender-inclusive democracy requires the active engagement of civil society, political parties, and international organizations. It is crucial that women's organizations be given the resources and platform to advocate for policy change, gender justice, and social equality, leveraging Africa's strengths for democratic consolidation. As Africa looks to the future, it must draw strength from its diverse cultural heritage, youthful population, and growing economic power. By focusing on inclusive governance, youth empowerment, economic development, and gender equality, the continent can strengthen its democratic systems and build a more stable, prosperous future. In 2024, Africa made significant strides in areas such as free elections, peaceful political transitions, and civil society activism, but the work is far from over. By continuing to promote democratic principles, human rights, and good governance, Africa can move closer to its goal of achieving a democratic renaissance that is inclusive, resilient, and transformative. Through sustained efforts and collaboration, both internally and externally, Africa can build a future where democracy thrives, ensuring that every citizen has a stake in the political, economic, and social processes that shape their lives. The path to lasting democracy. Advice to African leaders. As Africa continues its journey toward democratization, the role of political leadership remains at the core of its success or failure. African leaders must recognize that their leadership extends beyond the temporary pursuit of power to the long-term health of democratic systems, societal cohesion, and the well-being of their citizens. In 2024, the continent's diverse experiences with democracy offer invaluable lessons. To build lasting democracies, African leaders should focus on the following key actions. 1. Commit to democratic integrity. It is crucial that African leaders prioritize the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, and the integrity of electoral systems. Leaders must set an example by upholding democratic principles, ensuring that elections are free, fair, and transparent. This includes respecting term limits and peacefully transferring power in accordance with democratic norms. The willingness to accept the will of the people and to relinquish power when necessary is the hallmark of true democratic leadership. 2. Promote inclusivity. A thriving democracy is one that includes the voices of all citizens, particularly marginalized groups. African leaders must prioritize gender equality, youth engagement, and the inclusion of ethnic minorities in political decision-making processes. Empowering women and young people to take up leadership positions will not only strengthen democracy, but also foster more innovative and effective governance. 3. Fight corruption and strengthen institutions. Corruption undermines public trust in government and slows democratic progress. African leaders must take bold steps to combat corruption within their administrations by implementing strict anti-corruption measures, promoting accountability, and strengthening democratic institutions. Independent electoral commissions, transparency initiatives, and robust judicial systems will build confidence in the democratic process and foster public participation. 4. Protect human rights and civic freedoms. African leaders must champion human rights and safeguard civil liberties by ensuring that citizens can express their opinions without fear of retaliation, organize freely, and access information. An open, free press is fundamental to this, as it serves as both a check on power and an important vehicle for public discourse. 5. Invest in education and capacity building. For democracy to flourish, an educated and informed populace is essential. African governments must focus on investing in education, particularly in civic education, that empowers citizens to make informed decisions, understand their rights, and engage constructively in the democratic process. Similarly, leadership training programs should be established to cultivate responsible, visionary, and accountable leadership. 6. Foster regional cooperation and Pan-African unity. African leaders should recognize that many of the challenges facing the continent are shared challenges that require regional cooperation. By strengthening organizations like the African Union, AU, ECOWAS, and SADC, leaders can work together to address issues like political instability, climate change, economic inequality, and security threats. A unified, cooperative approach will be crucial in addressing external pressures and achieving sustainable democratic development. 7. Adapt to the digital age. Leaders must embrace the potential of digital technologies to enhance democratic governance. This includes transparent online platforms for engaging with citizens, electronic voting systems, and tools for monitoring elections. At the same time, African leaders must also regulate digital spaces to ensure that they are not used to spread disinformation or suppress dissent. Summary of key messages. As we look back on the state of democracy in Africa in 2024, several key messages emerge. 1. Democracy in Africa is an evolving process. While many countries have made notable progress in strengthening democratic institutions, challenges such as corruption, authoritarianism, and political instability remain significant. 2. African leadership plays a critical role in ensuring that democracy is not only achieved but sustained. Effective leadership must prioritize the rule of law, accountability, human rights, and inclusive governance. 3. Civil society, the diaspora, and youth are vital actors in the fight for a more democratic and prosperous Africa. Their continued engagement in the political process will ensure that African democracies are more inclusive, innovative, and resilient. 4. Regional cooperation is essential for addressing shared challenges. Pan-African unity, through organizations like the AU and ECOWAS, provides a platform for peaceful conflict resolution, economic integration, and political stability. 5. The digital revolution presents both opportunities and risks for democracy. African governments must embrace digital technology to enhance transparency and citizen engagement while regulating online platforms to prevent the spread of harmful disinformation. 6. Gender equality and youth empowerment are not just moral imperatives, they are essential to building a more dynamic, inclusive democracy. African leaders must create policies that foster gender parity and youth participation in all aspects of governance. 7. Education is the foundation for a successful democracy. Governments must invest in civic education to ensure that citizens understand their rights, responsibilities, and the importance of participating in the democratic process. A call to action. To African leaders, the message is clear. The future of Africa's democracies rests on your commitment to inclusive governance, transparency, accountability, and human rights. The journey is long and the challenges are many, but with strategic leadership and a deep commitment to democratic values, Africa can build a future where democracy thrives, freedom is protected, and opportunity is available to all. The world is watching, and the citizens of Africa are ready for change. The task ahead is monumental, but the potential for positive transformation is within reach. Let 2024 be remembered not only as a year of challenges, but as a year that paved the way for a stronger, more democratic Africa. In conclusion, African leaders must remain steadfast in their pursuit of good governance, committed to democracy, and focused on building a better future for their citizens. The road to a truly democratic Africa will not be easy, but through unity, resilience, and strong leadership, Africa can forge a path toward lasting democratic success for future generations. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to like, comment, and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest content. Join the conversation in the comments. What are your thoughts on Africa's democracy in 2024? Until next time, keep standing strong for the bold and vibrant future of Africa.